Welcome to the Secure CIO, the podcast for technology executives who are tasked with hiring and retaining great cybersecurity leaders. Join best-selling author Claire Pales together with industry thought leaders as they answer your questions about sourcing the right leaders, building cybersecurity teams, candidate selection, salaries, skills, and more.
Hello, I'm Claire Pales and welcome to the Secure CIO podcast. Today's guest is Graeme Cowan. Graeme is a mental health and resilience author and speaker. Graeme, thanks so much for joining me on the podcast today.
My pleasure, Claire.
Graeme is the author of the best-selling Back from the Brink book series and a board director of Are You OK? Over the last 5 years, he's helped thousands of leaders and teams to be more caring, resilient and growth-oriented. Through coming back from his own breakdown, he learnt the importance of having a caring and supportive team around him. He believes that the future belongs to those that help their teams embrace uncertainty, encourage diverse ideas, and commit to action. Graeme, I wanted to invite you onto the podcast for a few reasons. Firstly, I feel that Are You OK? Is an incredible community of people with a message that we can all get behind. This year marks your 12th year of Are You OK Day, which will happen in September. And as a board director of the movement, it's certainly something that I'm sure you're very proud of. And secondly, in my industry, cybersecurity, there's a lot of talk about burnout. And I thought it might be a good topic for my listeners to hear more about ways to manage burnout and also the warning signs to look for in their staff and how to build resilience. But as a starting point, I'd love to hear a little about your story and how you got to where you are today.
I started my career in sales and marketing, then moved into recruitment and human resources. And I was working as a headhunter in the last market crash. And that led to, real burnout for me. I ended up being out of work for 5 years and, my marriage broke down. It was just, a really, really terrible time. And I think my evolution out of it involved a few things. It involved starting to walk again, starting to reconnect with family and friends that I'd isolated myself from. And also meditation became a really key element. And I think also another pivotal step was deciding to write my first book, Back from the Brink. And what made that so important is that I deliberately did it to help other people. I thought that sharing my story and also capturing other people's story would be helpful. And so it became a exercise and a purpose bigger than myself. And that was really an important realization. And I think it is great insight into the whole topic of resilience as well. And it was actually through my books that I first met Gavin Larkin. And Gavin had tragically lost his father to suicide. His father's name was Barry, and Barry was quite a incredible business person. He was an ex-McKinsey consultant. He was an advisor to people like Kerry Packer, John Singleton, Jerry Harvey. And it turns out that he had bipolar. He'd have this mercurial highs full of ideas, and then he'd crash down. And Gavin lost his father 15 years before, but it was still having a profound effect. He was having to explain to his son why the grandfather wasn't around anymore. And that just led to him having this idea. He was originally going to do a documentary on the impact of suicide on families, not at the moment, but also going forward. But for whatever reason, didn't quite get up. And so he just had this really brilliant idea of Are You OK Day? And what I think made it really brilliant was his tagline, "A conversation could change your life." And that makes it just all-inclusive. If he'd started a National Suicide Prevention Day, it wouldn't have grown. It really wouldn't. But he really sought to address the root cause of despair and isolation. So that's really how I met him in March 2009 and worked with him in a small group to launch it in September of that year in Parliament House in Canberra. And it was such an interesting year because we had, very little money, no employees, but we just had a real belief in the purpose. And from his perspective, he had profound regret at losing his father to suicide. And I had profound relief that I didn't put my family through the same thing. And, we were successful at getting a real tribe behind it to start with, and that just really, really grew. And I think part of the secret was, the great tagline, which was all inclusive. Everyone could relate to a conversation that helped them go through a tough time. Then we really made it open source. We weren't asking people for money. We were asking them for their time to support those around them. And I think that really is a critical element which led to the growth and the success of it.
And I guess from your perspective, your belief in the power of that message, and also obviously your own struggle with mental health and what you had been through, are they some of the things that really drove you to be part of the beginnings of Are You OK?
Yes, very much so. Like I'd had, as I mentioned, my marriage broke down and I was really unwell. I couldn't work, and I went to live with my parents. And it was their support that got me through. I know that I wouldn't have made it if I didn't have their unwavering support and belief in me. And so that's where that real firsthand knowledge of empowering the people around to help was a really critical element. It's not everything, but it's a really critical element, and the one that Are You OK chooses to focus on.
In my industry in security last year, there was a survey conducted across the globe actually of hundreds of chief information security officers, and 9 out of 10 of the people that were interviewed reported high stress levels, a third reported stress-induced physical health, and half reported mental health issues. And on top of this, they also talked about the fact that they weren't taking their annual leave. Many of them were working far longer than the usual work day, sometimes far longer than the usual work week. And I'm interested, when you hear statistics like this, what are your first thoughts about what these leaders are going through?
It is a really interesting topic, because if you work in an area that you really believe in, you feel a sense of purpose, that could be really good for us. And so I don't really believe so much in the concept of work-life balance, because that assumes that work is bad, life is good. And if you believe in your work, work can be very, very good for you. Lots of evidence around shows that work is essential to our well-being. But having said that, we also have to make sure that there's time in our day, in our week, for the things that really help us. And I talk about, in the area of resilience and well-being, I talk about 3 categories of that we need to continually top up all the time. And the first is vitality. So that's our physical health. It's our exercise, resting well, eating well. Then there's intimacy, which is, they're the people around us. And all the research shows that it's our social connections that have the most massive impact on our well-being. In fact, the longest well-being study ever done, something called the Harvard Grant Study, has actually shown that, following the one group of people for over 75 years, and that those that had caring and supportive relationships around them had the longest life, the healthiest life, the most affluent life, the longest sex life. So there's a lot to be said for it. And then finally, the third one is prosperity, and this is our contribution health, and it comes from, in many cases, the work we do, volunteer work for charities or causes or sports teams or schools. And each of those 3 areas, the vitality, the intimacy, and the prosperity, fill what I call glasses of well-being. But those glasses, it's like sitting outside in the sun, they evaporate. The water evaporates. And we need to top up each of those 3 glasses on a regular basis, because we can't have one cup full and the rest empty. We really have to strive to have each of those cups in the right sort of area.
There's actually a really great TED talk about that Harvard study, the 75-year study that you were talking about, that I'll pop into the show notes. Just talking about those glasses being equally, I guess, shared effort from your part and filling those glasses so that people feel fulfilled. It's very hard, I guess, when you're in a role that doesn't necessarily allow you to switch off. And, security has very much an on-call nature about it, and it often leads to leaders and those at the heads of teams or in C-level positions, really working around the clock or feeling the pressure to be working around the clock. And what mechanisms have you found to be effective in teams that you've seen in these types of vocations where there's a lot of pressure? How can they wind down and disconnect? And is that actually possible?
Yes, there's definitely challenges. And one of the best examples I've seen of teams that really address that is from the Boston Consulting Group, BCG, and as you may know, when they work on projects, they're like 24/7 projects. They really have this critical timeline, high pressure, high money, except everything else. And they were finding that they were burning out people, and often they were the young MBAs that were coming into the organisation. But about 13 years ago, they tried something called predictable time off. And so how that works is that people, when they start a project, they decide when they're going to have predictable time off, and the team works together to cover for that person over that period of time. So, it could be having 3 hours off on a Wednesday morning or whatever time. But what makes it incredibly powerful is that the person chooses the time and the quality thing they're going to do during that period. So it could be as diverse as, going to the gym. It could be having quality time with the kids. It could be writing a novel or taking photographs, something to completely switch off. And it's been incredibly successful for BCG. They're now number 3 or number 4 best places to work in the US in the Fortune 100 group. So that's an example where, a really intense environment has come up with something that really made it happen. And as I mentioned at the start, it was originally put together for these young MBAs, but it was actually the partners that, 2 or 3 years down the track talked about incredible relief, because there was this big chunk of time when they were off and they could explain to the client in advance that they would be off during this time, and all the team members work together to cover for that person when they're away. So that's, I guess, one example. I guess the other thing is just incorporating micro breaks in everything we do, even when we're on. And I first read about this with, the Navy SEALs in the US that, walk, have to be on guard and hyper alert all this period of time. And they have a way to help them turn off and even sleep really quickly. And, your audience can probably Google this to find out the full details. But in essence, what it is, it's lying down, being in a comfortable space, breathing in for 4 seconds, holding for 7 seconds, and breathing out for 8 seconds. And Marines and that sort of thing have found they can sleep in war zones with all sorts of noise around them by mastering that technique. So even in the most volatile and uncertain situations, there are ways that we can do it. And even, another thing that I do in my workshops and presentations, that I just have people stand up. They've been sitting down all day, just to stand up, stand about half a centimetre taller than you normally are, with your shoulders back, and just a shorter version of that breathing exercise, just to breathe in for 4, hold for 4, breathe out for 4, and to just do that for 4 cycles. And then I ask people then to open their eyes and just describe what they feel, and they all say relaxed, refreshed, and it's literally 1 minute. It's 1 minute. And so incorporating these micro breaks, I think, is really important. And the evidence shows that we just can't work relentlessly. We think we can be machines, but all the science on productive work, so we're best off to work intensively in pulses for 45 minutes and then do 15 minutes, something completely different, turn off, call a friend, call a colleague, walk outside, look at the sun, get some vitamin D. But, all the evidence shows if we want to sustain performance, it is in pulses, 45 minutes and 15-minute breaks.
And it sort of leads itself to what you just talked about there with the breathing, but also what you spoke about with Boston Consulting Group around allowing yourself that time to just switch off and take in your surroundings and refocus on something completely different. And having the mindset that is an okay thing to do. What role do you think people's mindset has on their ability to either not burn out or to end up in a real burnt out situation?
Absolutely massive. And my message to your audience is that self-care isn't selfish, that taking care of ourselves is ultimately the best thing we can do, because if we do that, we have energy left to support our team, energy there to support our loved ones. And what I really advocate is doing an assessment. I have an assessment called a Selfcare snapshot, and it's a one-pager, and people can find it on my website for free. It's at graemecowan.com.au/selfcare. And so this self-care snapshot has 5 questions under the vitality area, the intimacy area, the prosperity area. And each of the 5 questions is out of 10. And so you see which is your emptiest cup, your emptiest cup of well-being. And the next part is about talking about and planning when you're going to do that in the next week ahead. And it's really key to do that, to think about, this is, I do mine on the Sunday, plan my week ahead. So when am I getting my exercise? When am I seeing the people who are important in my life? If I think about my work, what are 3 things that I get done this week, which would be really, really helpful? And ideally, put those into your diary. Now, this doesn't mean that you'll do it 100% of the time, but it's a default. And you will end up doing it if you plan ahead. Peter Gollwitzer is an expert on intention to action. And he says that if just by deciding when and where you're going to do this strategy, you will increase the chance of it happening 300%. So, again, we have to pay to probabilities. People that are, on call just need to realize that we aren't machines, we're not computers, and ultimately we are more productive, we are more insightful, we're more influential when we are fresh, when we can refresh ourselves, where we do keep on topping up those fuel in each of those 3 glasses.
And having that sort of default diary around when you do certain things and how you're going to manage the overwhelm of the week must give people a sense of control as well.
Very much so. And if I talk about, people discovering their one thing. And people's one thing, I tell a long story about how it evolved, but just to quickly sum it up, it comes from a very old movie, a funny movie called City Slickers, and there's a crusty old cowboy on there who's just on top of the world, and these 3 burnt-out, middle-aged city slickers are trying to get their mojo back. And he says, you've got to just discover, your problem is you don't know what one thing is. And they say, well, what is it? And they say, well, that's what you have to find out. But if you find it out and you do it, everything else takes care of itself. And so your one thing is when you are really present, when you are in the moment. And for some people, that could be exercise. For some people, it could be quality time with family and friends. For some people, it could be a hobby, playing the piano, photography, gardening, something along those lines. So when I take people through that exercise, I then say, well, who does their one thing enough? In the last week, who did it enough? And you're lucky to get maybe 30%, say that. And so that's your wake-up call. I wasn't asking for your number 10 thing. I was asking for your number 1 thing. And we've always got time for our number 1 thing. Now, I did this presentation for the top finance group for a top 10 Australian company. And the CFO, decided that his one thing was going to be running. And so he decided to put into his diary from 1 p.m. to 2 p.m. every day, he was going to run. And he chose to run. He was in Sydney. He chose to run in the Botanical Gardens. And he worked out that over the first month, he didn't do it every day, but he did it 3.5 times per week. So he actually had worked that out as a true number cruncher would. But the point is, not only was it helpful for him, but the people that worked for him reported doing that as well, not necessarily running, but going to the gym or getting outside. So there's tremendous power in a leader walking the talk about well-being and resilience. In fact, there's a study that I share in my presentations that shows when a leader does that, it increases engagement and discretionary effort from the team, increases well-being of the team, and it increases the longer that people stay with the organisation. So that's another reason why self-care isn't selfish, especially for leaders.
It's a really interesting point, and there's another guest on this season that I've interviewed who talks about the fact that every time you show up as a leader, you're a role model. Whether you're a good leader or a bad leader, you're a role model. And that importance of, in that story you just told, the CFO probably had no idea the benchmark or the precedent he was setting for his staff to feel comfortable that they could also take that time to go to the gym or to have that time out by him setting a precedent and showing that it's possible.
Very much so, absolutely.
And I guess talking about environments where people are setting examples and creating comfortable or safe places for their staff, I'm interested in your advice around, particularly for my listeners who are CIOs and security leaders, how can they create a safe space for their staff to call out things like high stress levels or if their resilience is being tested?
I think it's the most number one most important question that leaders should be asking themselves right now, because the whole COVID-19 has taken things and the level of change and the level of acceleration of trends. What's happened in 3 months has probably been as much as what was going to happen in a decade in some areas, just the level of change. Like, who would have thought we'd all be working at home and not going to pubs or cafes? You wouldn't have predicted it, but somehow we've managed it. So the good thing about that is we know that significant change is possible quite quickly if we need to be. But from a leader's perspective, I really recommend that if they want to have a high-performing team, they need to be continually asking themselves these 3 questions. Are we connected? Do we feel safe? And do we have a shared future? So the connection is all about the sense of belonging. It's being part of a tribe. And it is our most fundamental need. In fact, there's a guy called Matthew Lieberson who actually debunked Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And he actually said that social inclusion is our most basic fundamental need, because it is key to our success. And so there's all sorts of ways that we can be connected. We did a research study for Are You OK? And honestly, it wasn't rocket science. We asked people how they like to connect with their team. And they said things like, team lunches, go and get a coffee together, after work drinks, celebrations, et cetera, et cetera. So nothing too surprising. What was surprising is that 23%, almost 1 in 4 Australian employees said nothing was done for them to connect with their colleagues. Nothing, 0 out of any of those options. So although it sounds really easy, we do need to continually think about that. And we need to, I believe, ask our team about what can we do on a regular basis to connect. Even through this period where people have been working from home, I've seen teams do some great stuff, having virtual trivia nights and loud shirt nights and all sorts of things to, try and keep that sort of humour and enjoyment going on. So connection's paramount. The next step up is, do we feel safe? And what I'm talking about here is psychological safety. And for you in the technology space, your audience in the technology space, this is absolutely critical to high performance. Google did this Project Aristotle, where they sought to understand what was the secret to their best teams. They looked at 180 teams around the world, 250 different qualities, and they ended up identifying 5 team norms that were common in the most successful team. And number 1 to that was psychological safety. And what that means is that people feel comfortable taking risks, taking moderate risks. I'm not talking about physical risks. I'm talking about, trying something new, trying to solve a problem, going out on a limb. They feel comfortable being themselves, and they're strong into personal trust and respect. They have each other's back. And when that happens, if you can promote that, if you have high psychological safety and high performance pressure, you're in the learning zone. But if you have high performance pressure and low psychological safety, you're in the anxiety zone. So when people see that they can try things, know they'll be supported, learn from it, move forward quickly, that is the fastest way to evolve. And this is so critical to the technology sector. And then the third question is, do we have a shared future? And that means we create our future. And this is particularly relevant quite now because everything's been turned upside down. Work won't return ever to what it was before. So we as a group need to decide how we're going to be best positioned to thrive as we come out of this. What are the decisions we make every day to go forward? And when we make those decisions, when we have that shared future, we own it. And when you own it, that increases your level of control and your level of comfort. So asking those 3 questions and asking the team is really, really critical. Having that shared future, it's good for our well-being. It's good for the tribe. It just makes all the difference.
And I think your point around including the team in the decision around how you're going to build that resilience and enjoy growing together, having them inform what they want to do to be sort of socially inclusive means that, as you said, they own it and they buy into it, and they're much more likely to turn up when those types of events or activities are on. Yeah,
if I just share a short story about that, my wife, Karen, she's the head of research for Cancer Council in New South Wales. And 5 years ago, she had, I think at that time they had about 60 people in her team. And they facilitated a process where they were looking at what their future was going to be. And they really wanted to make an impact in the world. And so they decided that their future was having their research on the cover of Lancet magazine, the biggest public health publication. And, surprise, surprise, 4 years later it happened, even ahead of the schedule, that Karen's team's research was featured on there about eliminating cervical cancer from the world. Getting the team behind it, buying into it, is just paramount to have a thriving and a shared future.
Graeme, given your experience and the message that you're now spending your whole life sharing with people, what would be your key piece of advice for the audience about building safe, resilient and healthy security teams and leaders?
Yeah, well, we come back to something I mentioned before, is that self-care isn't selfish. So for leaders, to continually think about topping up that vitality, the intimacy and the prosperity area is paramount, because Harvard Business Research tells us that when we are in a positive mood, we're 31% more productive, 37% more influential, and 300% more creative. This is all pretty good for being, future ready and future proof. And as I've also already mentioned, when a leader does display self-care, team care almost happens automatically because they're in better shape. They're able to look out for those around them. They lead by example, but they're also open to input and ideas for the team around them. And people want to help. And, when I talk about this team psychological safety, people feel they're included, their voice is heard. It doesn't mean it's a democracy. At the end of the day, the leader has to make the decision based on the best knowledge they have. But at least if people feel heard, they know that they feel included. So that would be my summary is to continually practice self-care and to really think about, how can we stay connected? How can we stay safe? And how can we create our own shared future?
I've really enjoyed our chat today. I've written loads of notes that I'll include in the show notes around some of the advice that you gave. Obviously, your self-care snapshot is a really important document for people to download, and thank you for offering that for free and making it so accessible. The examples you gave around the Aristotle project as well and Peter Gollwitzer, I'll pop all of those in the show notes. On behalf of the audience, and I thank you very much for sharing with us around resilience and around burnout, and I'm sure the audience will take something from it today to help themselves and also help their team. So I'm very grateful.
It's my pleasure, Claire. It's been lovely to be with you.
That's all we have time for today. Thanks so much for listening. For more information on all our guests, check out the show notes at thesecurecio.com, where you can also find more information on the Secure CIO framework and sign up for my newsletter. If you loved the show, please subscribe to the podcast and feel free to leave me a 5-star rating. I'll see you next week.